to Stihl Incorporated's Chainsaw Safety, Maintenance, and Operation. This program has been developed to give chainsaw operators the basic information needed to properly and safely use a chainsaw. Although this program will cover a wide variety of subjects, Stihl always recommends that before you operate your chainsaw, read and fully understand your owner's manual. This manual will cover the important items that will be specific to your chainsaw's design, features, and operation. Now that you have cleaned your saw, reinstalled the bar and chain, and made the proper adjustments, it's time to sharpen your chain. A handy tool for sharpening the chain in the field is this stump vise that will hold the saw firmly while sharpening. If you are sharpening your chain in a workshop or garage, a bench vise will work just as handily. Other items you will need to properly sharpen your chain are a file and guide with the proper size round file, a flat file, and a depth gauge tool. Check your owner's manual or ask your authorized dealer for the proper file size and depth gauge tool required for your saw's chain. This information can also be found in the chain leaflet packed with new loops of Stihl chain. Before we sharpen the chain, it will help you understand the process better if you know the different components that make up your chain. These are the cutters. Your chain has separate left and right-hand cutters. They are the parts you will be sharpening. Located on the front of each of the cutters is a protrusion called the depth gauge, or as some people like to refer to as the raker or drag. The depth gauge acts much like the adjustment on a hand-plane chisel and determines the depth of the cut or chip that the tooth will take. The wider the gap between the tooth's cutting edge and the top of the depth gauge, the larger the chip the chain will take. If there were no gap between the cutting edge and the depth gauge, the chain virtually wouldn't cut at all. Your chain has been designed to cut optimally with a specific depth gauge clearance. Check your owner's manual or with your authorized dealer to see what gap is specified for your chain. You can see that the cutter's top plate has a declining slope. As the tooth's cutting edges sharpen back, the depth gauge will also need to be filed to maintain the recommended chip clearance between the tops of the depth gauge and the tooth's cutting edge. The chain consists of a series of tie straps and rivets which hold the components together, separating the left and right-hand cutters alternately. This is the drive link. It has several functions. It's the portion of the chain that engages the sprocket, propelling the chain around the guide bar. It acts as a scooping device, dispersing the lubricant that comes from the oiler to components of the bar and chain, and it guides the chain in the bar groove. For your chain to be sharpened properly, you must make sure that each tooth has been filed at the same specific angles with the proper file, that the top plate of each cutter tooth is the same length, and that the depth gauges are set at the proper height. Begin the process by looking for the cutter with the most damage or wear. This will become your master cutter. Once sharpened properly, this cutter's shape and length will be what all the other cutters should look like. Not doing so will result in poor cutting performance. Your chain will run roughly and could even break. As you file the first cutter, count the number of filing strokes that you take, and be conscious of the amount of pressure you're applying to the file. Using the same number of strokes, with the same amount of pressure on the rest of your cutters, should result in a consistent length on each. If you're uncertain, check the individual cutter's lengths with a measuring device. If you find that some teeth are longer than others, make the necessary sharpening adjustments. Always file the cutter from the inner portion of the cutter outward. Never file from the outside in. This will dull the chain and damage the file. And when you're filing, never allow the file to drag back across the cutting edge when pulling the file back. Doing so will quickly dull your cutter and damage your file as well. Your file and guide has a plate positioned on both sides of the file. Placing the file and guide on the chain, the plate on one side of the file will rest on the leading edge of the cutter, while the other plate will rest on the top portion of the depth gauge. Equipped with the proper size round file, and assuming that your depth gauges have been maintained in the past, this will give your round file the proper filing depth when sharpening, resulting in the proper edge on the cutter. Also, when filing, the file and guide should be held at a 90-degree angle to the bar, or level. Tilting the file and guide even slightly can result in a misfiled chain that won't function properly. On the top of your file and guide, you will see lines scribed into the metal. These lines, kept parallel to the guide bar when sharpening each tooth, will result in the proper angle required for the tooth's cutting edge. When used properly, Your file and guide will help assure a proper and consistent cutting angle and filing depth on each tooth. This is how a properly sharpened cutter should look. Here is a cutter that has been improperly filed and has a severe back slope, a sign possibly indicating that too large a file was used. This chain has a severe hook indicating that too small a round file was used, or that the file was pushed down too hard and allowed to drop too far down into the tooth during the filing process. Here you see a top plate with too shallow of an angle, and this is a top plate with too severe an angle. Now that you have the proper file and guide, and you have determined your starting point, begin your filing. Remember to count your strokes, the amount of pressure you're applying to the file, and do not drag your file back across the cutter. The right and left-hand cutters alternate, so you will need to file every other tooth from one side of the bar, or all of the right-hand cutters first, for instance. Then change to the other side to sharpen all of the left-hand cutters, again remembering to keep the angles and depth the same on all teeth. Once all of your cutters have been sharpened, on both sides, you'll need to check the depth gauge height and file down the tang if needed. Place the depth gauge tool on the chain as shown here, allowing the tooth's depth gauge to protrude in the slot of the tool. If any portion of the depth gauge protrudes above the slot in the tool, that portion will need to be filed down level with the depth gauge tool using your flat file. Perform this same procedure for every tooth. If the depth gauges are not maintained and are too high, not allowing enough clearance, this will result in poor performance and reduce the chain's ability to cut. If you don't use the proper depth gauge tool and file the depth gauges too low, below the manufacturer's specifications, this will result in a chain that cuts too aggressively, possibly causing harm to your saw and increasing the risk of kickback, making the chainsaw very unsafe, which can result in serious or even fatal injury to the operator. If you have filed your chain's depth gauges several times, you may find the leading edge of the depth gauge will need to be dressed to conform to an angle similar to how it looked when it was new. Steel depth gauges have a line scribed into the metal showing the proper angle for the leading edge for you to follow. If you don't maintain this angle, it can result in excessive vibration when cutting, as well as diluting the low kickback properties on some chains. For some people, sharpening a chain is very uncomfortable or even intimidating. If this is the case with you, you may want to keep one or more spare chains that are sharpened properly with you while you are working with your chainsaw. As your chain becomes dull, you can easily replace the dull chain with one of the sharpened spares. When you're done with your work, return your dull chains to your authorized dealer where they can be properly sharpened on a specially designed electric chain grinder, and you will be ready to cut again with a set of freshly sharpened chains. We hope that this program will help make your chainsaw cutting experience a safer and more enjoyable one. For further information about your Stihl chainsaw, see your authorized Stihl dealer. For more information on Stihl, please see our website at stihlusa.com or phone us at 1-800-GO-STIHL.